Welcome back to the Bits of Good Bootcamp. In this video, we're going to talk about React components and props. So, Components 101, from the React docs, it says here, components let you split the UI into independent, reusable pieces and think about each piece in isolation. So this is a pretty powerful concept of components, and really what at the end of the day it's doing is it's allowing us to abstract our entire UI into different pieces. And then only worry about those abstracted pieces in isolation as opposed to having to deal with the entire thing. So functionally though, components are really just like JavaScript functions. They accept arbitrary inputs, which we call props, props being short for properties, and they return React elements describing what should appear on the screen. And I think if you keep this kind of fundamental understanding of what a component is in your mind, it'll be useful going forward as we dive into the details of components. So the first thing to note is there's actually two ways of rendering components, or creating components actually. The simplest way is to use something we call a functional component. And you can see here this is literally just a function that is returning JSX. So this is very, very simple. It's not a lot of logic going on here. We're just taking props and then using that to create our function. And this is something that's really, really powerful. And typically what we call these are presentational components because there isn't any logic going on here. All that's happening is we are taking a couple props and using them to create some JSX. So those are called presentational components. This second example here is also a presentational component, but instead of using a function to write it, we're actually using a class. So this is using the JavaScript ES6 classes syntax. And so you can see here we have our same name, and then we have a render function, and the render function is returning essentially the same thing that the functional component returned here, just in the function. And then of course we are extending a React component, so this is allowing this to not just be a class but to be a React class. So yeah, that's the two ways to create components. And so now that we've created a component, let's talk about kind of starting to render components. Previously, all the JSX elements, the React elements that we've been using are just straight HTML elements, really, nothing special going on. But now we are going to start using user-defined components. So you can see welcome here is not a normal HTML element. Like I can't just go into Google Chrome or Safari and have a website with welcome tags and expect it to work. This is specifically React, and it's something that we've defined as our software engineer, and it's our component, and so this is our prop as well. And so when React sees an element representing a user-defined component, it actually passes all of these attributes. So there could be infinitely many attributes really. It passes them all to the component as an object called props. So here, for example, we only have one JSX attribute name, which has the value Sarah, and so what React will do is it'll bundle that up into an object and pass it as an object called props to the function component. So here, for example, that's what will be passed in as props, and that's what's being accessed here as props. Props are definitely something that you use a lot, so it's a very important concept to remember. Okay, now here's another example of kind of like a full-fledged user-defined component example where we're taking our welcome component and we're actually rendering it on the screen using our handy-dandy React DOM.render. So here, let's break it down. This is us defining our component. This is just a definition of a component. Now here on this line, we are actually using JSX and we're creating a React element and saving in the variable called element. And then here what we're doing is we're using React DOM.render, and we're rendering our element into our DOM root node. And at this point, it's worth mentioning that, as you can see here, component names always start with capital letters. That's a rule. You need to follow that. So here you see the function is starting with a capital letter. And then when we're using JSX to actually create our React element, that is also using a capital letter. If you don't use a capital letter here, you will probably run into bugs. So I really encourage you to remember this convention and rule. And let's take a second and look at this in an actual example just to convince ourselves that it works. Again, here we see this is us declaring the function, and then here this is us creating an element, and then finally it's being actually rendered into the root. And if we look at our HTML, if we can open this, okay, here we can see that we actually have indeed our root div. All right, now they're all open. Okay, let's go back to our slides here. Okay, so we've talked about how to use user-defined React components. It's a fair question to ask, well, can we use our user-defined components together at the same time like we normally use regular HTML components? And of course the answer is yes. So here what we have on the right is an example. This is our handy-dandy welcome component, and we're using a bunch of welcome components to create an app. And so here we have welcome component number 1 per se, and then a second one and a third one, and we are each passing them a prop that is distinct, Sarah, Cahill, and Eddie. And so all of these together are going to make up the app, and then the app is what we're actually going to render on the screen. Let's actually take a look here, make sure that this works as well. Just as we expect, we have 3 showing up. You should start to realize how powerful React is for this reason. You can take any component, define some simple HTML and logical mappings, and then you can use that as a building block to build more complicated components. So instead of calling this app, I could call this like friends list. I need to update this here too. And now it's not just an app, this is a component, and there could be another React component that uses friends list as a building block to build a more complicated component. Let's leave page. All right, so this kind of leads into the idea of breaking things into components, and that's how we abstract away details in our React application. Anything that you're going to reuse a lot is typically a good candidate for a component. And typically all React apps have one top-level component, sometimes called app, mostly called app, especially in this case. And that's what is being rendered inside of our React DOM.render. But truthfully, this React DOM.render should only appear once in your entire code base, and then your top-level app component is where you should put all your other React components. You don't want to have a bunch of React DOM.render calls throughout your project. Okay, so now we have kind of an idea of how React user-defined components work. And so here on the right, we see that we have our comment component, and it's pretty complicated. There's a lot of things going on. We are displaying user information, we're displaying an avatar image, and then we're also displaying the comment text and then the date that the comment was posted. And so in your head, you could probably think, well, I could probably abstract away some of these things into other components. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So let's start. The first thing that makes sense is abstracting away the avatar stuff into its own component. So here now, I have my own component for an avatar, and here it's just taking, and it's returning an image element here, and it's using props to get the source and the alternate text for that image element. And then you see here, we're plopping it into our comment component just so. And so already you see that this has shrunk the amount of code that we need here. I'm going to give you a quick before and after. This code essentially right here has now been replaced by just avatar. But let's take another step further. We can actually abstract even further and create this user info component, which uses the avatar component inside of it. And this is again our original comment component. And once again, you see here now the comment is getting much, much smaller than it first was. It's much simpler and makes more sense. It's very declarative. We see inside of our comment, we have our user info component. Inside of the comment, we don't really care how the user info is displayed. We just know that we have to display user info. And then we can get back to the business of actually displaying our comment text and then our comment date. And then the user info component takes care of displaying the user's name and the avatar. And a good rule of thumb in general is that if part of your UI is being used several times, again, in different buttons, panels, avatars, whatever, then it's probably a good idea to make it its own component. And likewise, If a component is getting really complex, then it probably also just needs to be split up into different components. So for example, an app here shouldn't just be one really long JavaScript file with a bunch of things in it. It should be broken up into like feed story and comment, and abstracting away and using things as building blocks to build more elaborate components instead of just having one component that has all the logic in it. All right, and finally here, the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is props. Props, like we mentioned at the beginning, they're essentially like function arguments, and they're passed to React components before they're built. The really important thing to remember, though, is that props are read-only, meaning they are immutable. You cannot modify props. You can only use them to display stuff. They're just read-only things. And so there's this concept in programming called pure functions. And so what pure functions are, if you don't know already, they don't modify their inputs, and they will always return the same result for the same inputs. So essentially, no matter how many times you call a function, as long as the inputs are the same, it will always return the same results, and it will not modify any of the inputs. And React expects that all React components will act like pure functions with respect to their props. And this is how it's able to do such high performance stuff with the shadow DOM, because it's able to look and say, okay, well, as long as a component's props haven't changed, it should not have re-rendered. And essentially, it won't force it to re-render because it knows that the props haven't changed. All right, that's it for this video. At this point, you should have a decent understanding of how React components are set up, as well as how they can be composed together to form more complex components. And you should have a ballpark understanding of what exactly a prop is and how those are used inside of components to display data, as well as how they are used to accept kind of like parameters for components. See you in the next video.